session. It's more of an interview session,
Yeah.
to be quite honest. So we talked a little bit. So this is, once again, we're at the 42nd Newell Lectures here at Anderson University with Dr. Ellen Davis. I'm Nathan Willoughby, Dean of the School of Theology and Christian Ministry. And so we're going to just jump right in. And I'm going to start with the question I shared with you we would perhaps talk about, which is, how do you think the context of teaching seminary students, being at Duke Divinity School now for the last, I know you've been at other places, but how has the context of where you've been a scholar shaped your scholarship?
Okay. So I am going to take it back before Duke. So Duke is my 6th seminary, and where I've either studied or taught, and it's my 4th teaching job. And so I'll just take them in order, if I may. My study was, well, I should say, my undergraduate study was, because it really bears on it, my undergraduate study was at the University of California in Berkeley and the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And because I'm an Episcopalian, I didn't really study the Bible growing up in church. So I didn't really study the Bible until I was in Jerusalem as an undergraduate. And another way of putting that is, there was never a time when I studied the Bible that I was not in the land in which it was written, and at the same time learning the language in which it was written. So that unquestionably has shaped the way I read Scripture. And I was also, so my first teachers in Scripture were all Jews. And that just shaped a certain disposition towards Scripture that would be very different if I had started out, say, at an American seminary where people were really focused on issues of historical criticism. It was just, who wrote it, what half verses was, can you assign to this writer, what half verse to this writer, that kind of thing. I mean, and then I'm going to fast forward a bit. My PhD was at Yale, studying under Brevard Childs, who had the German-Swiss doctoral study, but frankly was not very interested in those issues anymore. He'd kind of been there, done that. And so when I came to Yale and I had my first interview, when I first arrived in New Haven, and I said to Brevard Childs, I preach, and I'm not going to get over it as a bad habit. So so that's how I figure out how I think theologically. I now realize that he was probably the only major biblical scholar in the world who would have said, I think that's just fine. And so from the beginning of my doctoral study, I was encouraged to ask the kind of questions for the church that brought me into doctoral study, because I tend to think of myself as working for the church, and the setting in which I do it is a university, is a major research university. And rather than thinking of myself, which would be perfectly legitimate, as, in the first instance, a university person who was also a member of the church. Does that make sense? And so, I would say that in several ways, my current context at Duke is stimulating for me because I can't assume the people around me agree with me or share my perspective. I don't know what's happening, but I'm...
He's adjusting the video.
Okay.
It'll raise too, actually. The whole thing.
So I like the fact that, as Stanley Hauerwas, my now emeritus colleague in theology, often says, you know, people at this university think I'm too smart to believe what I believe. You know, and I like being in a place where people don't share my assumptions. I find that, you know, they're not hostile to my assumptions. I wouldn't like that. But the fact that as my most important undergraduate teacher said, the most important role of a teacher is to explain the basic things over and over and over again. And I think that's not only good for an audience, I think it's good for us to think, you know, why is this important? And so I'll mention two other things that have been shaping for me. One was at Virginia Theological Seminary, my job previous to Duke, so I was there 96 to 2001. And my first year there, I had in my class, and I was teaching the introductory Old Testament interpretation class, the sort of year-long class. And in that class, amongst the 60 or 70 people, were two bishops, and Virginia Seminary tended to bring in bishops from the majority world, most of them from Africa, and they were bishops who had been sent by their archbishop because they were people who would be major church leaders. So one of them became the Archbishop of Rwanda, the other one became the Archbishop of Sudan and South Sudan. And this was 96, it was 2 years after the Rwanda genocide. And I remember Archbishop, or Bishop then, Daniel Dengbol, saying to me, if we don't, this was in the middle of the genocide in Sudan, and he said, but he foresaw that eventually South Sudan would be separate and independent. And he said, if we don't educate our people, we will be the next Rwanda. Well, as you know, it's come too close to that in South Sudan since independence. And so both of them, and I remember Emmanuel Colini, Archbishop of Rwanda, saying, we baptized, but we did not teach. And both of them would say that the primary problem in their countries was that tribal identity was more important than Christian identity. Now, you can say something very similar in this country now. And in fact, right after January 6th, 2020, one of my friends who's a bishop in Sudan wrote and said, I'm so sorry, we know exactly what you're going through. And, you know, there's a shock in hearing that from that context to realize, yes, they know exactly what we're going through. So I would say that experience of teaching people living in extremis forced me to think, I was at that point 10 years into my teaching, forced me to think, what really matters? You know, I was sort of far enough along that I was no longer anxious about what I didn't know, but what really matters enough for these folks to have left their churches in the drastic situations they were in to come and study with me. And so those kinds of questions still guide me. And to bring it up to the present, I would say that to me now, probably the single most pressing question to which I'm giving attention has to do with climate emergency. And Duke has put this in a central place in the work of the university as a whole. And for me, that means discovering what as a biblical scholar do I have to contribute to that. And it is surprising to me that the scientists and the social scientists at the university think that they need me. And I was talking to somebody at the business school this week, and he said, don't quit, we need you for this, because all of them are trying to decide what to do in their communities. And I live in North Carolina. Most of the places that you go in North Carolina, as one of the social scientists said to me, 80% of the conversations I have, God is named. And she said, I don't have any language to deal with that. It's not, I have something to contribute, but it's not that. So, that's a very long answer to your question, but
I certainly think that context we shape our context in ways of, I think you've been influential in even the ability for the scientists to care about your perspective has been your ability, has come from how well you've communicated and translated things. So one of the questions I was going to actually ask you, and so you may feel like you've already answered this, so you can just say pass.
Okay.
But what led you to start reading the Bible to where land, climate, and environment was so central to your efforts?
No, it's slightly different. So I was 40. I'm 72 now. And I had just come back from California visiting my parents where I grew up. Or I grew up in California. They were by then I grew up in the Bay Area. They were living in the wine country then, somewhat north of where I'd grown up. And I don't drive a car, but a friend of mine had come to visit, and we just took a drive around places that I remembered from my childhood, again, this was the wine country, so it would have been places, we would have gone on a Sunday drive or something. But I remember seeing highway running in front of farmhouses that I remembered being farmhouses from my childhood. And somehow that really, I saw it differently than I had seen it. And I was living in New Haven, Connecticut, and I came back and I was sort of traumatized by it. And I spoke to a friend who also had spent the summer in California, and he said, I guess what I recognized was that the changes that had happened in California in my, at that time, 40 years, something like 4 decades of active memory, and I compared that to what I know of the Middle East over something like 4 millennia, and I thought, well, we sure don't have 4 millennia ahead of us, if this is the way, we're doing. So I spoke to my friend in New Haven, and he said, Ellen, has God forsaken our world? And I said, and I quote, it's a little bit indelicate, I don't think so, but he sure as hell is mad. And that's what I think. So it's what I still think. And so I decided, well, I need to do something about that. And so I started teaching a class that I called variously biblical theology of land, biblical ecology, and just to kind of create a structure in which to consider some of these issues. And I fairly, several years, and I think everybody at Yale University who'd ever been on a farm was in my class. I mean, it was just, I was in a highly urbanized environment, obviously, and I'm essentially a San Franciscan. What do I know about these issues? But, I thought it was important. So I just started teaching, and pretty quickly I realized that the Bible is focused on land issues because it was a land-based economy. And I wasn't equipped to deal with that, so I went down to an undergraduate library to the soil sciences section and just started reading the shelves. I knew if I went into the graduate library, I didn't have a chance of getting out alive. I mean, but the undergraduate library, I thought, okay, I can take a section on. So I did. So I was just reading the shelves, the spines of the books. And there was a title that grabbed my attention, and as I pulled it off, the notion sort of framed itself in my mind. Whoever came up with this title understood how the Bible thinks about land. And it was called Meeting the Expectations of the Land. And it was a collection by Bruce Coleman, Wes Jackson, and Wendell Berry. None of these people had I ever heard of. This would have been 1991, maybe, something like that. And so there was an essay in there by Wes Jackson, who's founder of the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas. Your family's from Kansas. My father was from Kansas. And so he founded the Land Institute, and the Land Institute's work is to develop agriculture that works like an ecosystem, and develop for the high grass prairies of Kansas a grain agriculture that works with perennial grains rather than annual grains. So very impressive work that's now been going on for 40 years. And then it wasn't very long afterwards that I saw on some stray bulletin board at Yale that Wes Jackson was going to come and give a lecture at the forestry school, which was the School of the Environment. He was just going to give a lecture. So I went to the lecture, and he started talking about, Wes says, I don't do problems in agriculture. I deal with the problem of agriculture. Agriculture, as we have practiced it for 10 to 12,000 years, focusing primarily on annual crops grown in monoculture, is a problem. It is the problem. As far as he's concerned, it's the fall of humankind. He's a Wesleyan. He's a graduate of Kansas Wesleyan. So, well, when someone starts talking in millennia, I begin to listen. I think, okay, we have a problem here. You know, if it hasn't been a problem for millennia, it probably isn't a great problem. But, you know, this seemed like something that one needed to take on. So I said, may I come and spend part of my sabbatical at the Land Institute? And so I did. And that was, and then I published something in the Land Institute's journal, and then Norman Wurzba, who wrote to me and said, basically, can we be friends? And he's a theologian who works on land. And then I started working on a book that became something called Scripture, Culture, and Agriculture, and Wes was reading it, and Norman was reading it, and they said, Wendell has to read this. So I started sending it to him, and he said, oh, this makes a lot of sense. And so, you know, it just kind of, and I found that, meanwhile, my students, the more I got into this, the more my students were able to help me bridge the gap, because a number of them had much more rural background. By then, I'd gone to Virginia Seminary, and a less highly urbanized area. And so what they all gave me was all of these people for whom land is their deep experience, which it will never be for me, but I knew I could trust them to tell me, you know, where I was veering off. And on the other hand, as I say, I mean, Wendell is a close reader of texts, and he said, oh, this makes it all seem much less magical. And I'll say one other thing and then stop. And that first season that I was at the Land Institute, Wes Jackson asked me a question to which I did not know the answer. He took me out to lunch my last day, and he said, why does the Bible always get it right about land? And I didn't know enough to know that the Bible did get it right about land. I certainly didn't know why it got it right about land. And I said, I don't know, but I'll get back to you. And so I've been getting back to Wes for a long time since then. And I think the answer to that question is that Israel had no margin for error. The land that the Israelites occupied was basically the hill country of Samaria and Judah, which is marginal for agriculture in the best of times. It was the Philistines who were on the plains, and so they didn't control the really good country. And so if they were going to continue there generation after generation, they needed to learn how to care for their land without waste. That was not the same situation in the great riverine empires of Mesopotamia and Egypt. And so those were agricultural civilizations, but they had room to make mistakes, and they did make mistakes. So especially in Mesopotamia, where what used to be the primary millennia ago was the primary agricultural area, it's all salt flats now because they over-irrigated. And so they just, you know, the water table rose and you can't grow grain there now. And if you look at maps of Mesopotamia through the centuries, you see the major centers of civilization keep moving upstream because they were over-irrigating. I mean, it's really quite telling.
Yeah.
So, and Israel couldn't do that.
Wow. So one time in class, we were doing one of Wendell Berry's essays, and he's talking about the size of some farm. So the students will tell you, they'll call you out, they know. And I said, whatever size of farm that Wendell Berry was calling a large farm, he probably wrote this in the 80s. And I had a student in class who was like, that's a tiny farm. Just as that keeps shifting too. So the students will tell you, won't they?
Yeah.
My next question has to do with the concept that you've encouraged those of us preparing to preach to slow down, but perhaps all Christians to slow down when reading scriptures. What do you think the payoff is, and why is it so important?
Okay. So that came actually from one of my students. It was the first time I was teaching the Old Testament interpretation class, the one I just told you, a year-long course. I was at Yale Divinity School. We were about probably 6 weeks into the class, and one of my students said to me, and I'm sure it's the same here, certainly, by the 6th week into class, you were 1,200 pages behind in your reading, and you knew that you would never, ever catch up, and so what are you going to do? But she said to me, when I started this class, I thought the problem was I read too slowly. Now I think the problem is I read too fast. I thought that was a lot of learning for 6 weeks. And so I think the payoff, basically the payoff is what we just did today. We were looking at 4 chapters, and we could have spent much longer on it than we did. But just looking at a few verses in 4 chapters, and maybe another place it came from, I told you, my first teachers of Bible were Jews. And in Jewish tradition, you study Talmud. And the central text you're working with, and a Talmud is a big volume, kind of like that. And in the center of each page is text about that much at the very center, and everything around it is commentary. And one opening of Talmud, which is 2 sheets, you spend a year on that. And if you spend less than a year, then nobody thinks you got very much out of it, And that just kind of that's just a very different way of thinking. But I can tell you that after a lifetime, and I still study with Jews, they know text. And it's not just that they know it, it's that it shapes them. And it's a world in which they move. And they carry it with them. And that's, I guess, and I think it's something similar to that has enabled me to teach in Africa, in East Africa, where my upbringing has relatively little in common with the upbringing of the average South Sudanese villager, but we share text. And if we slow down over text together, and I tell them what little I know, and I ask them what that means to them in their culture, we're going to get someplace. So, yeah, that's where I think it gets you.
That's helpful. All right, you actually helped me segue to my next question.
Okay.
This comes from the Reverend Kevin Todd. he sent this one in last night. Could you comment on biblical interpretation for preaching in a Christian context that often expects the quick Christocentric reading of the Old Testament?
Oh, yeah, sure. He was a Duke student? Okay. So, first of all, 75% of the Bible is written in Hebrew. Who's counting?
You and Dr. Lozano.
Yeah. So, and now I'm going to go to Bonhoeffer. And Bonhoeffer, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was martyred in Tegel prison about 3 weeks before the war ended in Germany. And Bonhoeffer, in his what are now collected as his letters and papers from prison, written in about the last year and a half or two of his life, says that he finds himself more and more reading the Old Testament. And his reason for that is, and he's using a deliberately anachronistic metaphor, he says the Old Testament puts the church in the middle of the village. And by that he means, actually again, not so different from what we've been talking about today, that it deals with all the ordinary stuff of our lives. You know, who are the leaders of the community? How do you get along in your family? How do you put food on the table? How do you need to organize as a community for all of that to happen? And what on earth does that have to do with your life with God? You know, these are the things that the Old Testament is on about. And he said, again, writing in a Nazi prison, it's a very strong comment. Anyone who gets to the New Testament too quickly is no Christian. And I think it's precisely, in a sense, because of if you don't go through all of that sort of propedeutic, how do we organize the ordinary stuff of our lives in a way that, to use Wendell Berry's language and Wes Jackson's language, that our small economies in all their dimensions are congenial with the great economy of God in all its dimensions. If we don't do that work, then we are not Christians. And it's, to use another Bonhoeffer phrase, it's a kind of cheap discipleship. So there it is.
That's good. So we talked last night a little.
May I say one other thing?
Yeah.
You know, if you skip over Jesus' Bible, then do you think you're going to do a great job with the New Testament? You know, if it was, you know, if it's
good
not
enough for Jesus,
exactly, it's good enough for us, right?
We talked last night, and I found your comment about you found the one Bible scholar who was going to take your question seriously.
Oh, Bard. Oh, okay.
In Beverage Child, yeah.
Yeah.
So, because we had talked a little bit about just kind of the approach that this school takes to biblical studies and how that compares, and I was struck by your comments. So I'd invite you to say what you said and then go a little further about. I'm not compelled by historical criticism. I'm compelled for your vocation as a Bible scholar. What compels you about biblical studies and teaching biblical studies?
Okay. So, I'm just trying to think of how to. So I told you that in my first interview when I went to Yale and spoke to Brevard Childs, and I said that preaching was how I knew what was important to me theologically, and how I figured out my theology, and he encouraged me to keep doing that. And so I think if it wasn't the first paper I wrote at Yale, it was the second paper I wrote as a doctoral student, was on John Donne's use of scripture in preaching, focusing on Old Testament. John Donne, the 17th century poet, but who was a great preacher, and that's what he expected to be remembered as, not as a poet. And that was something that interested me. Now I think naively, I assumed it would interest my professor at Yale. It did interest my professor at Yale. Probably would not have interested any other biblical scholar in the world, apart, from Brevard Childs, but it interested him, and he was the only one I had to, please. So what I felt from that was that he was freeing me to be who I am, which, as I said to you at the beginning, I do my work for the church, and the contexts in which I do that happen to be primarily university divinity schools. And so I would say that the questions, all of the questions that interest me, and this I knew when I applied to graduate school, I thought of applying in pastoral theology programs. And then I realized if I studied in one of those programs and did Bible on the side, I wouldn't be a good enough biblical scholar. I just wouldn't have developed my skills adequately. So I sort of took the chance of doing a classic biblical program, hoping that I wouldn't just dry up on the vine, which was a real danger in 1983 studying, and so I said in that same interview, I'm not so interested in the Bible and before, which is to say I was okay not to learn Akkadian, which was the primary language of the ancient Near East. And that was a pretty revolutionary thing to say in 1983 at Yale. And Brevard Childs' answer to me was, oh, I took Akkadian once. I couldn't read a sign now. It's all written in cuneiform. And he said, so why don't you go ahead and do what interests you? So what I did then was focus on how the Bible functions authoritatively, whatever authoritatively means in different communities, how the Bible makes a difference in the communities that read it and think it should make a difference. Those communities being both Christian and Jewish. And that's basically what I've done. And so, and I do it knowing that the only expertise I bring is reading biblical text slowly and carefully. and other people are going to have to tell me why that's important. And so now I'm working with colleagues, as I said, at the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke, in law, in business. All of them can tell me why the way I work with a story helps them do their work around climate change in North Carolina. I couldn't tell them why it should matter to them, but they can tell me. In terms of preaching, I think the most important thing I could do, I'm not trained in homiletics. I mean, I'm not really trained in homiletics. I took a course, it wasn't a very good course in seminary. But, I consider that my only real contribution, again, is being able to read a text slowly and carefully in a way that's interesting. And if I can do that, other people ought to be able to figure out what that signifies. I don't know. But it's okay that I don't know. So, and so far it's worked out okay.
I think so.
So,
All right, let's see. I feel like we're nearing my last question anyways.
okay.
So I'm going to share a little bit about something that I learned, that a comment you made in class, and invite you to elaborate on that.
Okay.
So we were in class, and some student was maybe trying to be troublesome. Like, well, come on, what good is the psalm where we're bashing babies' heads against rocks?
Oh.
And I just remember your comment. This has stuck with me. I've told other students who've been in my classes that you talked about how it's a different thing for people to pray that prayer when they don't have nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
What is the role of teaching? Because there's all kinds of stuff in the Bible. I mean, I'm still hesitant to have my fourth grader read it sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So is your question about violence in the Bible, or
just the way that understanding the context, the timing, and the audience. So we walked through the Warner Solomon Gallery as well this morning, and just talking about it was a different thing when there were marginalized immigrant communities in the U.S. that had not been assimilated into whiteness to have Jesus drawn in their image, than when that becomes kind of an appropriated thing. And so just the timing and context, maybe just elaborate on.
Okay. So I guess I would say this is why I have taught at Duke for such a long time, because I have never taught any place where I cannot say, we're all agreed on X. With 61 different church groups represented, we're not all agreed on much of anything, and so I find that really, really stimulating for me as a teacher. It's also a source of a lot of information for me as a teacher, because if I say one thing, someone else is going to say, well, not exactly. And in most cases, they say it in a very charitable way. And so, one thing I will mention is that I have a former now doctoral student from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And he wanted to write his dissertation on the prophets. And I don't quite remember how we got to this, but I think I kind of prompted him to write on the book of Nahum, which is all about God's vengeance against the Ninevites, okay, the Assyrian Empire, which, as you know, wiped out the northern kingdom of Israel, okay? Now, I could not myself write, and he's a Roman Catholic priest who was during the wars in Congo in the 90s. He was in seminary, high school seminary in Congo, climbed out with all the boys the window when the school was attacked by the militia. They went into the woods. They lived in the woods for 3 weeks, I think. Never thought they would come out alive. And I said, "What did you do?" And he said, "We wrote poetry." "Oh, really?" And he said, "Yeah, we all wrote laments." And, studying with Jacob, Jacob was my student, but we were studying together, and we've taught together. And he wrote this dissertation on Nahum, as I say, which is about God's, a God of vengeance is Adonai, is the kind of key phrase in that. It's all an elaboration of that. Well, he understood why that was a comforting message to people who have watched their world torn apart and taken down to the ground. And he posited, of course there's no proof for this, but it's entirely plausible. I sent him pictures out from the British Museum of where they have the bas-reliefs that come from the palace at Nineveh of the destruction of Lachish, the second city of Judah, in which you see all the Israelites being packed, either on the ground, slaughtered, or being packed up and taken into exile. All of that made perfect sense to him, and he posited that the book of Nahum is written by somebody who had experienced that. Now, he can't prove that. He knows he can't prove it. But he said, if you think of the poet as someone who came out of that culture, and this was a major city in Israel, obviously a very well-educated, and whoever wrote Nahum is very well-educated, and can describe the destruction of a city with enormous vividness. And he said, so what if somebody lived through the destruction of Lachish and now, inspired by God, is envisioning God taking Nineveh down to the ground? And that's what the book of Nahum is about. That's why Nahum is in the Bible, because it speaks a word of justice and comfort in that context. That book has the happy title of Piles of Corpses, Heaps of Slain, I believe. And it became a pick of the month from Barnes & Noble the year it came out. Not a lot of the dissertations I've directed have become pick of the month for Barnes & Noble, because it speaks to a lot of people. So, I mean, that's just an example of, and you have to remember when you're reading the Bible, Psalm 137, happy are those who take your little ones, speaking to Babylon, and bash their heads against the rocks. You know, what that's saying is, what a happy outcome if Babylon does not endure into another generation. If the destruction they have wrought on country after country, people after people, cannot be continued. Again, that's not the kind of thing that you can say from where we sit, but it makes a lot of sense. And it makes a lot of sense if you realize that Israel was on the losing end of almost every conflict. You know, our sort of picture that it was the biggest thing going in the ancient Near East, it was a pin dot on the unfolding scroll of empire. And those empires were Assyrian, Babylonian, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, take your pick. And I remember when I was a student, someone who's now a colleague in Israel, Moshe Halbertal, talking about reading the Psalms of imprecation, like Psalm 137. And he said, we, using the we of the Jewish people, he said, we could say those Psalms in the shtetl. We could say those Psalms when, against the Russian Tsar. We can't say those Psalms now with the third most powerful army in the world. It's a different context.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, I think we got time for one or two questions. If anyone out there has something burning, if you'll just shout it out, I'll just repeat it for the mic or the stream. Leanne?
Thank you, Dr. Davis, for being here. I'm curious to hear you talk more about the sort of habit or discipline of slow reading of the Bible. I'm thinking of pastors who are so often caught in the constant churn of ministry that really demands that they somehow be excellent at absolutely everything and spit out, a sermon week after week, and there's just this sort of sense of ministry life having an acceleration that really seems at odds with some of this deeply soul edifying slow reading of scripture. So I'm just wondering if you have some sort of habits or practices that have helped your students live into sort of slower engagement with scripture that might serve them in a really challenging context of ministry.
So a question about habits and practices to do the slow reading when you're in a rat race of ministry. That's my summary.
Okay.
You said a lot faster.
Yeah. No, it's good. So I would say, first of all, be really, really careful about what you read. Because we can all think about our bedside tables and most of the things that we'll never read. And so I think you have to select carefully. The texts for a given Sunday, those themselves are not very long. And so I would say, and probably in different traditions, people have different amounts of freedom in terms of what they have to preach on or whether they can select whatever. So I would apply the same principle, thinking about what the constraints are in your particular tradition and what your bishop or other, people you have to answer to are going to tell you. But I think insofar as you can decide, okay, this year I am going to pay attention to this part of the Bible, whatever that might be. And I'm just going to try to figure out what it's doing. And that will be my focus, and I'll be sure that anything that I read helps shed light on that and doesn't take me spinning in a lot of other directions. I think you'll get someplace. And if that's, I remember a bishop saying to me, and bishops are, on the whole, pretty busy people in my church. He said, so I've just spent a year with Brevard Childs, my teacher. He had read his Exodus commentary, and he just spent the year reading that commentary. I think that was a really good use of the year. And I know that was that particular bishop's habit. He would just each year kind of pick, you could do it with Bart on Romans, or, whatever. I'm just going to try to spend this sustained period of time getting a little deeper into what's going on here. My discipline as a biblical scholar is to try to write in a way that is supportive of that kind of effort. So I write for people who have the kind of question you're talking about. I don't, in the first instance, write for people who have my particular education. And so it means I'm dealing with less technical things most of the time. And I find that actually very edifying for me. And it helps me, if I get too much in the weeds, then I can lose sight of the larger question, what's really going on here? And what does this biblical writer want me to get? And what, if this text were not in the Bible, what would we be missing? I've just given you an example from the book of Nahum. I now think, because of Jacob Onyumbe, I think he's convinced me that we'd be missing something if it weren't there, that I couldn't see before. But I think if those are your sort of guiding questions and your goal, you'll come up with something. And over time, one is in ministry, God willing, for the long haul. Over a lifetime, I think that kind of discipline, it will keep you going, and will keep pastors going, and it will keep the people going, and it will also shape the kinds of things that they all think are important. And those are not necessarily the things that the morning news drew to our attention, to say nothing of the countless number of ads or whatever's on social media. So I think some of it is a discipline of resistance. And again, that's something Bonhoeffer wrote about from prison. He called it the disciplina arcana, the sort of secret discipline, and he found prison actually a rather good place to practice that discipline. But again, it's a discipline of resistance against the dominant culture. Obviously, the dominant culture for him was easier for him to recognize as the enemy than maybe we can recognize some of the pernicious aspects of our culture.
I'm going to make that our official concluding remark. There will be a few unofficial concluding remarks, but I think we'll sit with that. Thank you all, those of you online, and for those of you here in present in person, for attending this. Thank you, Dr. Davis, for your time and your preparation and your witness.
Thank you.